I'm sitting in my driveway, windows down, coffee in the cup holder, staring at a neon orange envelope tucked under my wiper blade. It felt less like a parking ticket and more like a ransom note from the devil himself. $500. For what, you ask? For this. My own truck. On my own property. I swear, the absurdity of it all hit me so hard I snorted coffee right out my nose. And honestly, if I hadn't laughed, I'd have probably just sat there and cried, and my neighbors already think Big Red's an eyesore. They definitely don't need to see me sobbing on the asphalt, too. But here's the thing about ridiculous situations. Sometimes they're just begging for a good fight. So stick around, because by the end of the story, that $500 fine will look like Monopoly money. A flimsy, meaningless piece of paper. And the reason why involves a forgotten paragraph buried deep in a dusty rulebook, a surprisingly pivotal Vietnam vet, and one ridiculously smug lady named Francine, who truly treats the HOA rulebook like it was carved on stone tablets handed down from a suburban deity. You ready for some suburban chaos? Buckle up, because this is going to be a bumpy ride. If you've ever felt like your HOA was out to get you, or just enjoyed watching a good old-fashioned David and Goliath story unfold, you're in the right place. The crime. So, let me set the scene for you, Maple Ridge Estates. Sounds fancy, right? Like somewhere you'd sip mint juleps and discuss dividend yields. In reality, it's a perfectly manicured, utterly predictable slice of suburbia where every lawn is trimmed to the exact same height, like the grass went to boot camp and graduated with honors. My house, well, it's the one that proudly sports an 8-foot sunflower patch that tends to lean a little too far over the sidewalk, much to the chagrin of my more aesthetically minded neighbors. And then there's Big Red. Big Red, my trusty 2001 Ford F-250, is more rust than paint these days, I'll admit. She's got character, you know? A few dings, some faded spots, and that telltale rumble that announces her arrival long before you actually see her. But don't let the weathered exterior fool you. She starts first crank every single time, without fail, and has faithfully hauled every friend I've got through at least one grueling moving day. She's been a lifeline, a storage unit, a weekend warrior, and frankly, a part of the family. I backed her into my driveway that Friday after work, just like I always do. Killed the engine, listened to the satisfying click of the doors locking, and headed inside for a well-deserved weekend. Fast forward to Monday morning, and there it was, the neon orange violation notice. Commercial vehicle parked in public view. Fine, $500. Pay in 15 days, or lien proceedings begin. I read it not once, not twice, but 3 times, just to make sure I wasn't still half asleep or worse, hallucinating. Commercial vehicle? Big Red doesn't even have company decals. She's just red. And yeah, big. Apparently, in a neighborhood where the most masculine car you typically see is a pastel-colored Tesla, a truck with a bit of grit is considered an industrial menace. I swear, I could almost hear the collective gasp of the hydrangeas at her sheer audacity. My first thought, somebody on the HOA board must have been incredibly bored, or perhaps Big Red just clashed too aggressively with their meticulously chosen exterior paint palette. Look, I was irritated, absolutely. But I'm also a grown-up, mostly. So I figured, okay, I'll address this like a rational, mature adult. And by that, I mean I decided to do what any grown-up who's ever had to deal with bureaucratic nonsense would do. I marched straight to the next HOA meeting armed with a carefully curated arsenal. I had color photos of Big Red looking perfectly innocent, her registration papers proving she was indeed a personal vehicle, and because I believe in covering all my bases, a generous bag of Hershey's Kisses. Hey, a little strategic bribery never hurt anyone, right? Especially when you're facing down the formidable forces of suburban rulemakers. The wall. Meeting night. The air in the community clubhouse was thick with a palpable tension, a mix of polite smiles and simmering resentments. The board sat behind a folding table that looked suspiciously like the one from my garage, arranged like they were judging a middle school science fair project. And there, at the head of the table, was Francine. She was wearing a blazer the color of wet cement, her hair helmeted into an unyielding, gravity-defying coiffure, and her glasses dangled from a pearl chain that seemed to clink ominously with every slight movement. She greeted me with a smile, the kind of tight, practiced smile she probably reserves for puppies she secretly dislikes. It was clear she was ready for me, and frankly, I was ready for her. I explained my case, calmly and rationally, I thought. This truck, I began, gesturing vaguely in the direction of my driveway, though Big Red was obviously not present, is personal, not commercial. It's titled in my name, and crucially, it weighs under the 10,000-pound limit that your own covenant quotes for commercial vehicles. I even went the extra mile, offering a compromise. I'd be happy to park nose in, if the sight of her taillight shadows offends any passing poodles. A few titters erupted from the gallery, a small victory, I thought. I felt like I was winning, that logic and reason were prevailing. Then Francine, with a theatrical flourish, flipped to page 47 of the rulebook. It was a well-worn page, I noticed, probably a frequent flyer. She tapped a highlighted line with a perfectly manicured finger, her gaze never leaving mine, and delivered her verdict. Any truck over 3/4-ton capacity, she enunciated, as if reading a death sentence, is a utility vehicle and must be garaged or screened from public view. My heart sank. I blinked. My truck, Big Red, was exactly 3/4-ton. Not an ounce more, not an ounce less. It was like she had a personal memo from the universe. But I don't have a garage, I stammered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. She merely offered a dismissive shrug, her pearl chain swaying gently. Not our problem, she said, her tone as cold and unyielding as her blazer. The board, a gaggle of nodding heads, then voted, unanimously, to uphold the fine. It was a gut punch. As I gathered my papers, feeling thoroughly defeated, a kind neighbor patted my shoulder and whispered, "Just pay it, man. You'll never win against Francine." But that whisper, meant to console, just ignited a spark. Challenge accepted, I thought, as I walked out of that stifling room. You see, I might have lost the battle, but the war, the war was just beginning, and I was going to fight it with every ounce of wit and stubbornness I possessed. That night, the defeat stung, but it also fueled something fierce inside me. I poured myself a tall, strong glass of iced tea, the clinking of ice cubes the only sound in the quiet kitchen. I sat down at the table, cleared away the mail and the grocery lists, and cracked open the infamous 212-page tome, the Maple Ridge Covenants and Restrictions, last updated in 1997. This wasn't just a rule book. It was an archaeological artifact. My mission, to find something, anything, that could give me an edge. I started highlighting every shall, may, and must, my pen scratching across the thin, brittle pages. It was like deciphering an ancient text, filled with legalese and obscure clauses. By 2 a.m., my eyes were burning, and a migraine was starting to throb behind my temples. But amidst the headache, I also had questions. So many questions. Why, for instance, was there an entire clause dedicated to hitching posts for horses in a subdivision built in 2006? Were we expecting equestrian traffic? And why did basketball hoops require earth-tone backboards? Did a vibrant blue hoop somehow threaten the delicate ecological balance of Maple Ridge? These were the kinds of arbitrary rules that made you wonder if the original authors had a particular vendetta against fun, or perhaps just color. But one question, one particular inconsistency, kept me awake. The truck rule. It mentioned capacity, specifically 3/4-ton, but it said absolutely nothing about color, condition, or even age. It was so specific, so narrowly tailored, that it felt less like a general regulation and more like a ban designed to exclude one very specific type of vehicle. And that begged the biggest question of all. Who were they trying to exclude? What was the unspoken history behind this oddly precise rule? I had a hunch, a nagging feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye, or the rule book. The next morning, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a stubborn determination, I emailed the county records office. For $7, a small price to pay for a potential victory, I got my hands on the original 1984 plat for Maple Ridge, and that's when the real digging began. What I discovered was a revelation. Maple Ridge Estates wasn't always the pristine suburban utopia it is today. It used to be farmland, owned by a family named the Pritchards. And old man Pritchard had a son, a Vietnam vet, who came back from the war wheelchair-bound. To maintain his independence, he drove a modified Chevy K30, a truck specifically adapted to fit his lift. A truck that, you guessed it, was the exact same size and capacity as my Big Red. Suddenly, it all clicked. The covenant wasn't born out of snobbery or an aversion to large vehicles. It was born practical, born out of necessity, out of a desire to ensure that veterans, especially those with mobility challenges, could park their adapted trucks without hassle. Somewhere along the line, over the decades, the original purpose got buried under layers of new amendments. The wording got tightened, and the human spirit behind the rule was completely forgotten, replaced by bureaucratic rigidity. I felt like Indiana Jones, finally holding a dusty, brittle Grail diary, the key to an ancient mystery in my hands. I had found my loophole, a forgotten piece of history that would rewrite the narrative. Now, I just needed witnesses to make it stick. The campaign. Armed with my newfound archaeological discovery, I knew I couldn't just walk into the next HOA meeting and drop this bombshell. I needed to build a groundswell, to make this our problem, not just my problem. So, I spent an entire afternoon at the local print shop, churning out flyers. Bold, attention-grabbing, and a little bit provocative, they read, "Do you own an SUV rated over 6,000 pounds? A Suburban? An Expedition? According to the board's strict reading, you're a utility vehicle too. Come to the July meeting. Public comment welcome." The next morning, on my usual jog, I tucked one under every single windshield I passed. It was a stealth operation, a quiet rebellion spreading through the perfectly manicured streets. And let me tell you, the Nextdoor app, that digital town square of suburban gossip and outrage, absolutely exploded. Notifications buzzed incessantly on my phone. People started realizing that if Big Red was a commercial vehicle, then their meticulously polished, oversized SUVs, the very symbols of their suburban affluence, could be next. Suddenly, it wasn't just Felix, that's me, by the way, versus Francine. It was half the subdivision versus ambiguous language, bureaucratic overreach, and the looming threat of arbitrary fines. I learned that Mrs. Kowalski's nephew had a lowered Silverado he only drove on weekends, a pride and joy that was now apparently a ticking time bomb of HOA violations. The Dollywall's immaculate Tahoe, a vehicle they treated with more reverence than their children, was suddenly deemed too tall at 76 inches. The fear, the indignation, it was all building, and I was fanning the flames. Oh, and here's where the universe decided to throw in a little comedic irony. In my meticulous research, I also learned that Francine herself drove a Lexus GX 460. A beautiful, pristine vehicle, no doubt. But here's the kicker. Its curb weight was a hefty 6,200 pounds. Oops. Suddenly, her own vehicle, by her board's own ridiculously strict interpretation, was a utility vehicle just waiting for a fine. I couldn't resist. One sunny afternoon, I baked a batch of my famous chocolate chip cookies, put on my most innocent smile, and knocked on Francine's door. When she answered, looking utterly bewildered to see me on her doorstep, I offered her a cookie, a gesture of neighborly goodwill. "Francine," I said, my voice dripping with feigned concern, "I was just wondering if you realized that your own beautiful Lexus GX 460, by the board's recent ruling, now falls under the utility vehicle classification? You know, over 6,000 pounds. Her face, usually a mask of stoic control, went through about 5 shades of crimson before settling on a furious puce. She didn't say a word. She just slammed the door so hard the wreath on it rattled like a maraca. I stood there for a moment, then burst into laughter, right there on her porch, until my ribs ached. Karma, it seemed, had a delightful sense of humor. Quick pause. If you're enjoying the suburban saga, this epic battle of man versus HOA, then do me a huge favor. Smash that like button so hard Francine feels the vibration through her clipboard. And hey, got your own HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one while I'm waiting for Big Red to warm up on frosty mornings. Okay, back to the trenches, because the main event is about to begin. The July meeting was a spectacle. The community clubhouse, usually half empty, was packed to the rafters. It was standing room only, a sea of expectant, slightly agitated faces. The folding chairs, already looking precarious, squeaked ominously under twice their usual weight. The board, Francine included, looked visibly nervous, their usual air of detached authority replaced by a flicker of apprehension. They clearly hadn't anticipated such a turnout, such a unified front. When public comment time finally arrived, it was a parade of suburban indignation. Resident after resident, armed with printouts from their car manuals, meticulously read out the weight specifications of their SUVs. My Suburban, a mere 6,100 pounds. Does that make me a criminal? Francine, one man challenged, holding up his phone. Another woman, usually so reserved, declared, "My minivan, which I use to ferry my children to school and soccer practice, is apparently a utility vehicle because it's a hair over the limit. Are you going to fine me for transporting my own kids?" The absurdity of it all hung heavy in the air. One guy, retired engineer with a twinkle in his eye, even brought a meticulously crafted scale model of his F-150 and set it on the table right in front of the board, like it was evidence in a murder trial. "Now, can anyone here tell me why this is a commercial vehicle?" he boomed, to a smattering of applause. It was brilliant. When Francine, clearly flustered, tried to adjourn the meeting for an executive session, a thinly veiled attempt to escape the barrage of public opinion, the crowd erupted in boos. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of discontent. That's when I raised my hand. Politely, I swear. I waited for her to acknowledge me, which she did with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all her carefully constructed rules crumbling around her. "I'd like to address the origin of the bylaw regarding utility vehicles," I stated, my voice cutting through the lingering murmurs. I then proceeded to read the 1984 veteran exemption, slowly, deliberately, letting each word sink in. I held up the photocopy of the modified K30 truck, the very truck that had inspired the original rule, and quoted the original note. "No resident shall be denied driveway parking of mobility-adapted trucks." The silence that followed was thick, like oatmeal. You could hear a pin drop, if that pin was made of sound-absorbing material. Francine's cheeks, already flushed, now matched her wet cement blazer, turning a deep, furious crimson. She finally managed to stammer. That clause was superseded." I countered, my voice firm. "Superseded where, Francine? Show me the amendment. Show me the documentation that officially removed this vital, compassionate clause." She couldn't. Her eyes darted nervously to the HOA lawyer, who, looking increasingly uncomfortable, leaned in and whispered urgently in her ear. The crowd, sensing a shift, a weakness in the armor, murmured excitedly. They smelled blood, and it wasn't mine. The turn. Here's where the whole thing shifted, where the comedy met a surprising, heartfelt turn. I knew I had them on the legal technicality, but I also knew rules, even good ones, could feel cold. So, I decided to tell them why Big Red wasn't just a truck to me. Why this fight wasn't just about a parking spot or a $500 fine. It was about something deeper, something far more personal. I lowered my voice, making sure everyone in the packed room could hear me, but also making it feel intimate, like a confession. After my dad died, I began, the words catching a little in my throat. I couldn't afford rent and tuition at the same time. For 2 months during my senior year, Big Red wasn't just a vehicle, she was my home, my apartment. I fixed her head gasket in a Walmart parking lot with nothing but a YouTube tutorial and a whole lot of prayer. I paused, letting that sink in. That rust bucket out there? She's my diploma, my first apartment, my road trip honeymoon. She's seen me through some of the toughest times, and she's been there for some of the best. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. "If we start erasing stories," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "if we start telling people their history, their struggles, their very identity, doesn't match the color palette of our perfect lawns, then pretty soon, We won't have any stories at all. We'll just have silence. A ripple went through the crowd. Heads nodded in understanding. Someone from the back started to clap, and the sound quickly spread. I even saw Mrs. Kowalski, the one whose nephew had the Silverado, discreetly wipe a tear from her eye. Francine, looking utterly blindsided by the emotional turn, quickly called for a recess, her voice tight with thinly veiled frustration. I felt a surge of triumph, ready to celebrate. The lawyer, however, returned from the recess with a bombshell that quickly tempered my victory dance. He looked directly at me, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Mr. Duru," he said, "the HOA can avoid admitting fault, and therefore avoid potential legal liabilities, by invoking what's known as a grandfather clause. However, this would require you to prove continuous residency since the original covenant's inception, or, more specifically, that your vehicle's ownership bloodline connects to the original intent of that 1984 exemption. In other words, if I could somehow demonstrate that Big Red, or at least her spirit, was directly linked to the original purpose of accommodating mobility-adapted and veteran-owned trucks, they'd waive the fine and even rewrite the rule. It was a lifeline, but it came with a catch. The problem? I bought Big Red used in 2015. I needed to find her original owner. The fight wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more challenging phase. I was now a detective, and Big Red was my cold case. The next week became a blur of frantic detective work. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, diving deep into Carfax reports, sifting through obscure online truck forums, and navigating the labyrinthine world of dusty title transfers. It was like trying to piece together a forgotten family tree, tracing Big Red's lineage back through time. There were dead ends, frustrating gaps, and moments where I almost threw my computer across the room. But I couldn't give up. Not now. Finally, after countless late nights and more coffee than any human should consume, a name emerged from the digital ether. Mr. James Jimmy O'Connell, Army First Sergeant, retired, and the original owner of Big Red, having first titled her in 2001. My heart pounded. This was it. I tracked him down to a small VFW hall in Harrisburg, a 3-hour drive away. The hall was quiet, smelling faintly of stale beer and old memories. When I found him, Jimmy was 78, wearing suspenders, a faded baseball cap, and a grin that was as warm and welcoming as a porch light on a summer evening. He invited me to sit, offered me a lukewarm soda, and listened patiently as I explained the bizarre saga of my HOA, Francine, and the $500 fine. His eyes, though a little watery with age, lit up when I mentioned Big Red. He rummaged through a worn leather wallet and pulled out a stack of faded photos. There she was, Big Red, in her prime, shiny and new. He pointed to one picture. "That's her, hauling lumber for Habitat for Humanity," he said, his voice raspy with affection. Another showed her towing a boat on Memorial Day, bright flags flapping in the wind. He told me stories, laughing at the memories, about how that truck had been his companion, his workhorse, his freedom. Then his smile faded slightly. He told me how he'd lost a leg to diabetes a few years back, and how he'd had to sell Big Red to pay for medical bills. He missed her, he admitted, a wistful look in his eyes. That's when I told him about the covenant, about the forgotten veteran exemption, and about the vet it was originally written for. I told him how his truck and his story was the key to unlocking justice for Big Red and, by extension, for everyone in Maple Ridge. We drove back together that afternoon, Jimmy in the passenger seat of the truck he never thought he'd see again. We rolled the windows down, the wind whipping through our hair, and honked the horn at every car that passed, a joyous, defiant sound. I swear I felt 12 feet tall. It wasn't just about winning a fight anymore. It was about honoring a legacy, about righting a wrong that had been buried for decades. And with Jimmy by my side, I knew we couldn't lose. The final showdown. The August meeting was less a meeting and more a coronation. Jimmy, looking sharp and distinguished, rolled into the clubhouse wearing his dress blue cap, his prosthetic leg polished to a sheen. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded immediate respect. The room, once again, was packed, but this time, the tension was different. It wasn't just anger, it was anticipation. I walked up to the board table, Jimmy right beside me, and presented the lawyer with Jimmy's original 2001 title for Big Red, followed by my 2015 transfer. The lawyer, looking resigned but also a little relieved, cleared his throat. Mr. Duru has provided sufficient documentation to prove continuous lineage and the original intent of the vehicle's purpose, qualifying it for grandfather protection under the 1984 covenant exemption, he announced, his voice devoid of any legal jargon, just plain fact. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Francine, however, wasn't ready to concede gracefully. Her face was a mask of barely contained fury. "I move," she interjected, her voice sharp and brittle, "that we reduce the fine to $1, on principle." It was a petty, final attempt to exert some semblance of control, to cling to her power. That's when Jimmy, who had been sitting quietly, stood up. He looked directly at Francine, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of years of command, "you can't put $1 on a man's dignity. Withdraw it." The room erupted. Cheers, applause, shouts of agreement. It was a resounding affirmation, a collective voice rising against arbitrary power. The board, finally reading the room, quickly moved to a vote. The result? A unanimous 5-0 vote to rescind the fine entirely, strike the archaic 3/4-ton language from the rulebook, and, in a truly groundbreaking move, add a new, clear clause. Mobility-adapted and veteran-owned trucks may be parked in driveways irrespective of capacity. But they didn't stop there. Emboldened by the community's engagement, they also voted to form a committee to review every single rule for unintended exclusion and outdated language. And Francine, to her credit, or perhaps under immense pressure, she remained chair but volunteered, through gritted teeth, I might add, to lead the review. I almost felt bad for her. Almost, because in that moment justice and a good dose of community spirit had prevailed. The ride, outside, dusk was painting the sky in glorious shades of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop to our victory. Neighbors crowded around Big Red, not with judgmental stares, but with smiles and congratulations. Someone handed Jimmy a lemonade. Another person was excitedly flagging photos on their phone. Kids, wide-eyed and curious, asked if they could honk the horn. Jimmy, with a twinkle in his eye, obliged. 2 short, triumphant blasts that echoed off the perfect facades of Maple Ridge, a sound of freedom and community. Mrs. Kowalski, the one who'd nearly shed a tear during my speech, approached me. "Never thought I'd cheer for a rusty truck," she admitted, a genuine smile on her face. I just laughed. "Beauty's in the mileage, Mrs. Kowalski. Always." We fired up the engine, Big Red rumbling to life with her familiar, comforting growl. Jimmy rested his hand on the dash, a gentle, almost reverent touch, like he was greeting an old war buddy he hadn't seen in decades. As we rolled slowly down the street, neighbors waved from their manicured lawns, not with suspicion, but with genuine warmth. The uniformity of the neighborhood, once so oppressive, now felt welcoming, like the entire community had finally exhaled a collective sigh of relief. It hit me then, as the last rays of sunlight faded. The fight wasn't really about parking. It wasn't even just about Big Red or a $500 fine. It was about remembering that behind every rule, every regulation, every line in a dusty covenant, there's a human story. And sometimes that wild patch, that slightly out-of-place sunflower, or that rusty old truck, is the very thing that keeps the garden honest, that reminds us of our shared humanity. So yeah, my HOA tried to fine me $500 for parking Big Red. Instead, they ended up rewriting their rulebook, making a Veterans Day. And here's a fun bonus. Francine's Lexus is now officially non-compliant due to the new interpretations. She's got 30 days to garage it or plant shrubbery tall enough to hide the roofline. Karma, it turns out, is a meticulous landscaper. If this story made you laugh, rage, or pump your fist in the air, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and share it with every single person you know who's ever lost sleep over a passive-aggressive violation notice. Let's keep reminding the rule makers why the rules exist in the first place. To foster community, not to stifle it. And if you ever spot a red Ford F-250 with one slightly mismatched door and a driver who looks suspiciously like he just won a minor suburban war, give us a wave. Jimmy and I are always good for a honk and a story. Until next time, keep your wheels on your driveway and your spirit absolutely wild.